Hello, welcome back. It's been a while. Today I'm going to do a lake mountain scene. I've tried to keep it reasonably simple in terms of the composition, and I'm going to be using mostly two colours, and I'll come on to that a bit later. So I'm using Canson Moulin de Roy cold pressed paper here, which I've taped to my board. And I'm just drawn a horizon line where I want my mountains to be. And what you see me doing here is just lifting a little of the graphite pencil just so it's not too dark on the page. Today I'm going to use a couple of colours from my Roman Smalls watercolour palette. And the first one is Quinethalone Yellow, bit of a mouthful. And that is a semi-transparent colour. And Mineral Violet, which is a transparent colour which also granulates as well. So just slightly above my horizon line, I'm just drawing in some simple hill mountain shapes. Now, it's been a while since I've done watercolour, so this was actually really good practice for me, and I did want to keep it reasonably simple and not overthink my mountains or hills. And so it is really just a case of some wiggly lines that kind of represent some scenery in the background there. So once I've finished doing my little sketch, I am going to wet my page, as I'm going to be doing this wet in wet. And I'm going to be using a silver black velvet brush for this, only because it's quite a thirsty brush, but any brush will do. And if you've got a mop brush or a quill brush or something like that, it will be easier just because it holds a little bit more water. As I go across the top of the mountain, I am trying to be careful to keep the edge as sharp as I can. And so I'm leaving the mountain area dry. And you could, of course, mask that off if you're not confident just doing it with the brush. Either way works fine. And this is quite useful because it's got quite a pointed tip, which makes it just a little bit easier for me. Once I'm happy that the page is thoroughly wet, I'm just tilting the board a little bit here just to make sure that I haven't missed any areas and I can see that there's an even sheen on the page. So you don't want it sopping wet running with water, but just a nice even spread. And I've just used my masking tape there just to prop my board up a little bit. But I change my mind and have it flat quite often. So do whatever works for you. So I have pre-mixed up the yellow and I've got that in quite a watery consistency to keep it nice and light. And I'm just randomly adding this to my sky area to create a focal point of light. And always there's a hair, every single time, but I managed to get this one off quite easily. So I do use quite a different selection of brushes as I go through this page, too many to mention really. But any brushes will do. It just happened to be what I had to hand, to be honest. Sometimes a flat brush is easier than a round brush, but really I didn't get hung up on the type of brush. So I'm just using the same one I wet the background with at this point. You will see me moving the board around quite a lot. While not ideal for filming, it is necessary for me to move those colours around in the sky and try and create that soft sort of diffused look. and it's just much prettier. And I'm going to be using the mineral violet next. And I have a few brands on this particular colour because it's a favourite of mine. And the Roman Smalls one is particularly lovely. The way that it splits out into this lovely lilac-y, purpley blue colour when it dries. With the added bonus that it does granulate as well, which is super pretty. I'm not following a picture or photo for this piece. It is organic, and so it's kind of just coming from my mind, as it were. So I'm not really overthinking things too much here. I'm just kind of placing the colour where I think it will look good. I did have a pesky run in that left-hand corner, which I had to keep dealing with, just because I had a little bit of a pool of water there. So what I tend to do is clean my brush off, dry it a little bit on the kitchen roll, and then just take it back with the brush and mop it up a little bit. But in the end, I got there. But there was a lot of toing and froing with that. And that's the wonderful thing about watercolour. You never know what's going to happen. And just deal with it as it happens. And sometimes you get some interesting things that occur when you're not expecting them. And that can, of course, work in your favour or not, as the case may be. But it's all a learning experience. This part takes a little bit of patience. Ideal world, you get it right first time. But, life's not like that always, so you have to make some adjustments here and there, and that's what I had to do with this. And just a case of mopping up areas that I was concerned were going to cause back runs, which I most certainly didn't want in my sky. So it just took a little while, but I got there in the end. Next, I'm dropping down to a size 4 brush round just to give me a little bit more control. And I'm using my darker value of Mineral Violet. And I'm going to try and maintain that first layer as much as possible, but I want it to be darker in certain areas. So I will just dab it here and there until I'm happy with how it looks. And again, move the board around and fix any areas that start to cause me problems. At this point, I'm pretty happy with how it's looking, and I just need to fix a couple of areas by adding a little bit more yellow back in above that mountain there. It's sort of, I had a bit of a dry patch on the page, which I didn't notice, but easily fixed. And yeah, it's diffused really quite nicely, and you will hopefully be able to tell what I mean about that lovely dispersion of colour that you get with the mineral violet, in that you get that underlayer that I did first of all with that lighter colour, and then the darker on top of it as well. My sky is now completely dry, and I let it dry naturally for the most part and then finished it off with a hairdryer just so it was completely flat. And for the mountains, this is the only part of the picture where I used a little touch of different colour to my two colours, and that is with the second value that you'll see me use on this mountain. And I added a little touch of indanthrone blue and transparent brown to this mineral violet mix, just for the shadow parts of the mountain. Just to demonstrate a couple of techniques here. The right hand mountain that I'm working on here I did on a dry page, so my mix was quite wet and that first value, and then whilst that was still reasonably wet I then went in with my darker shade. Then for the rest of the mountain range I pre-wet the paper first and then did wet and wet technique. Just to wet the mountain area with clean water here, I'm using a Da Vinci Cosmotop Mix B size 12 brush. Just to get those angles in, it's quite useful to use a flat brush here. And this one, that B mix is quite soft, so it's quite nice and it does hold quite a bit of water. And then I've gone back to using my size 4 round brush. Next, I'm adding in the sort of last value or the shadow areas, and it does look quite dark here. And I did want it reasonably dark because I wanted the sort of contrast between the bright light in the sky and the shadowy effect of the mountains. But it will dry lighter than it looks here, as always is the case with watercolour. Here I am just using my number 4 brush again, just to blend in that colour a little bit and make sure it's not too light at the top. Next, I'm using my Billy Showell Eradicator brush. As you can see, it's got quite a small tip to it, and it's like a mini filbert brush for those who aren't perhaps familiar. And it's really good for sorting out little mistakes or lifting out some highlights, which is what I'm doing here, particularly as it is small for smaller areas like this. It's not so great if it's a larger area you want to do, and in that case I would use a damp round brush or a damp flat brush to do that. I'm always amazed at how lifting really can change the look of something and give it such a dimension, because you always want that light as well as the shadows. And of course, you can leave the paper white and just leave that area unpainted, but it can leave that sort of hard edge, which isn't always quite as nice. Or it's too bright if you just leave the white of the paper. So lifting out is really quite a useful little skill. My mountains are dry and I'm removing that horizon line, and I'm going to use a fresh piece of tape just to reverse that and put it across the bottom end of the mountains just to protect that while I do the lake part. When I apply my second piece of tape, I'm trying to leave a really narrow piece of white paper just as a little gap between the bottom of the mountain and where the lake starts. It's not vital, of course, but it just kind of looks quite nice. I'm using my Raven brush to wet the entire bottom section of the paper, as I want to perform this part all wet in wet. I'm going to start by reflecting the shape of the mountains, roughly speaking. It is a loose piece really, so I'm not trying to be too precise here. And then I realised at this point that my paper really wasn't wet enough. Well, it was, but it just dried too quickly. So you'll see me kind of muck around with this quite a bit. And this colour that I'm using is that same colour that I added the indanthrone blue and transparent brown to. So mineral violet with a touch of those two added in. And then the rest is mineral violet and the yellow as they were on my palette. Having sprayed it with a little bit of water, it sort of helped a little bit, but it still wasn't as wet as I needed it to be. So I'm scrambling about a bit here thinking, okay, what do I do? So I re-wet the area entirely again, and well, you'll see what happens a little bit later on when I did that. But I just keep kind of carrying on as you do and thinking, okay, how can I fix this? And eventually I kind of got something unexpected, but I was actually pretty pleased with it. So it just goes to show that even when things aren't going quite according to plan, don't quit, just keep on going. At this point, I decided I really needed to paint this virtually vertically, as you can tell. I didn't really have enough water in my brush and my page wasn't really wet enough, but I was happy with how it had gone up to this point, so I wasn't going to start the whole thing again. And I thought I'm just going to keep working on it and see if I can pull this together. So I am just trying different things here right now, trying to figure out how I'm going to make this work. Well, somehow I kind of managed to get that mountain bit sorted-ish. And now I am just adding in some of that lovely yellow to reflect the sky above. Having added my yellow, I did something I don't normally do, and I tilted it backwards to try and get that yellow to spread into the mountain reflection. Now, normally when I'm doing reflections, I will always tilt the page down so it runs down the page. But for some reason, I did the opposite of that, and of course, ended up with a massive back run. And I was so annoyed with myself when I realised what I'd done. But having walked away from it for a while and walked my dog and come back when it was dry, I actually thought, do you know what? I actually quite like it. It adds a little bit of drama to the picture. So I did consider re-wetting the entire water area and starting again. But I thought, no, I'm going to leave it because I like it. And it doesn't matter what I set out to do. What matters is that I liked the end result. So I've committed to the back run at this point, and I'm just adding in some last little touches to create a little bit of texture and interest on the sides here. I'm just tilting my board around again just to make sure that that paint doesn't just sit in that bottom piece. So it gives a nice mix in with those other colours while it's still got a little water left on the surface. And then I'm going to let it completely naturally dry and see what I've got. Well, now my painting is fully dry, I'm going to remove that horizon line or protection. And it's all going really well to start with. I'm doing it gently because it's paint underneath. Now, washi tape really never lets me down, but this was the picture that just kept on giving. So, of course, when I got past the second mountain, I felt it was starting to lift it a little bit. And there. But luckily it didn't tear all the way. And what I decided to do was just take my little brush and just touch that in a little bit with some of the mineral violet that was left on my palette. And because I couldn't help myself, I had to add a couple of little birds in flight in the sky. And then what I did was used a Prismacolor white pencil just in a couple of areas along the mountains just to deepen those highlights that I'd added, or lifted rather. And once I was finished and took all the tape off, I thought that the shadows in the water for the mountains weren't quite dark enough, and that was sort of after I came back to it after an hour or so. So I just used a little bit of my spare paint that was left just to go over those areas and make them a little bit darker. And that's a wrap, as they say. I hope you enjoyed watching. I certainly enjoyed painting, mishaps and all. And I hope it inspires you to have a go at your own. Obviously, you can use the same colours or you can pick your own. But feel free to use the same composition if you would like, or come up with your own mountain range, entirely up to you. But the most important thing, as always, is to have fun. And that is it for now. And thank you again for watching. Bye bye for now.